want to welcome everybody to this evening's Arrow lecture by Professor Esther Duflo. I'm Deborah Satz, and I direct the McCoy Center for Ethics and Society, which is the sponsor of tonight's Arrow lecture. Before I introduce Professor Duflo, I'd like to say a word about the Arrow lecture series, which was established in honor of our colleague Ken Arrow, the Emeritus Joan Kenney Professor of Economics at Stanford. Ken Arrow won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1972 for his contributions to general equilibrium theory. Ken, along with Gerard Debreu, proved the existence of an equilibrium for an entire economy with all the prices affecting the supply and demand of every commodity. Walras had formulated this concept in 1874, but it took 75 years for the existence of such a solution to be proven. But as many of you know, Ken has made contributions in quite a few other areas of economic thought, which if they did give repeat performances for the Nobel Prize, could have won him a whole slew of other Nobel Prizes. He could have won a Nobel Prize for his work on uncertainty and risk, his work in social choice theory, and his work in any number of important policy areas such as healthcare, economic development, and the environment. His work develops and integrates the best of economic tools with a dedicated commitment to bettering the human condition. It's a true pleasure for us to host the Arrow series, and Ken was also a founding member of the Ethics and Society program, which is celebrating its 25th year this year. So in the spirit of the Arrow lectures, it's also giving me great pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer. Esther Duflo is a professor of development economics at MIT. Like Ken, she's absolutely committed to using and developing the best tools that economics can provide to help illuminate and solve important public problems, especially those relating to poverty and lack of development. Tonight's lecture is not only an Arrow lecture, but it also opens this year's series of the Center on the Ethics of Wealth. Duflo is one of the world's most important and recognized economists, tenured at MIT at 29, MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellow, and a winner of the 2010 John Bates Clark Medal, which is sometimes called the Nobel in Waiting. But as often been noted, she's not waiting to make the world a better place. In 2011, Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2012, Foreign Policy magazine named her one of the top 100 global thinkers. And she's recently been tapped by President Obama to serve on his Global Development Council. So what does she do? Well, over 1 billion people live today on less than $1.25 a day. Amazingly, very little is known about how they make economic choices and what interventions might actually help to ease their lives. While there are a lot of theories, they often fail to predict results, and we don't always know where the sources of friction between theory and world lie. Duflo is what is known as a randomista. She helped to introduce into development economics the randomized controlled trials commonly used in testing new medicines. This approach has been developed and refined at MIT's Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, also known as JPAL, which Duflo co-founded with Abhijit Banerjee and Sendhil Mullainathan, and which she now runs. In the lab's experiments, one group gets the economic treatment and the other gets a placebo, and the point is to show whether and why some interventions really work. This method can help us to see where the sources of friction are that undermine expected results. So just to give you one example, we know that even though people are sometimes given free access to mosquito nets, they don't always use them. And so one question is why? And you might think, well, maybe the problem is that parents aren't educated enough to know what the benefits are of using the mosquito nets, and so we should concentrate on education if we want to improve compliance. Well, is that true? Could it be that there's some other explanation? So Duflo tried charging a nominal fee for the mosquito nets and found, counterintuitively, that many more people were prepared to use them when they had to pay for them than when they were given away for free. These kinds of experiments require that the researcher be a student of detail. What's the best method of getting people to use mosquito nets? What's the best method of getting children into schools and ensuring that they learn? Should you encourage immunization by dispatching clinics to villages or reward parents with bags of rice? Or both, or neither? Our theories often get the predictions wrong, and we need experiments to learn where the friction lies. Once you think about this, the value of randomized trials seems obvious. And like a lot of important results in the world, it's what I would call ex post facto obvious. Once somebody points it out to you, you think, how could we not have seen this before? But it actually took some visionary economists to carefully design and carry out these vitally needed experiments. So through this method, Duflo is attempting to improve international economic development policy and move the field away from some abstract pronouncements about the best ways to fight poverty to figure out where the sources of friction lie. In 2011, she co-authored Poor Economics, A Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty with Abhijit Banerjee, a book which tries to distill what the lab has learned. It was awarded the Financial Times Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year, and it's been translated into 10 languages. Her work has an ethical significance that can't be underestimated. And that's not ex post facto obvious, that's just obvious, I think. So please join me in welcoming Esther Duflo. The title of her talk is Hope, Aspirations, and the Design of the Fight Against Poverty.
Thank you very much for having me here in the first place. It's a really truly an honor. Ken is an inspiration to all of us, and at least very, very strongly for me. And I've had a chance more recently to interact with him as a colleague in the context of a review we are editing together, and it's been. To be perfectly honest, like the reason why I'm still really there is because of the inspiration that came at the beginning from those discussions, and so that's why when I got the invitation to give this lecture, I really was very keen to make it work because I was really keen to give a lecture with Ken's name attached to it, and that I didn't think I would necessarily have this chance in my life. So it's a true joy. Thank you very much for the very generous introduction. I should have one disclaimer: the Bedneg experiment is not mine. It's Pascaline Dupas, who is actually faculty here, so you can interview her about it. And I was not involved in it. And the results are actually the opposite, which is actually doesn't matter how much. It doesn't matter if people pay for the bednet or not. There was a strong presumption that it would matter, and it was influencing policy a lot. So there was a movement against giving free bednets because people were worried that if they don't have to pay for the bednet, they won't use it. And you have anecdotes and examples of bednets used at fishing nets or wedding veils and things like that. And it's quite possible, actually. Why not? I mean, it's not a crazy claim to think that people need to pay for something to really value it. But what Pascaline did is that she decided to go out and check, and it turned out it's not true, and that had a huge policy impact, actually, that work, because that really turned around people's view on whether or not bednet should be given for free. And the reason why it's very important is because bednets is contagious, but not only it's contagious, the externality is not linear. So you really need to have a lot of people covered by nets to get rid of malaria in one region, because the mosquitoes try to go from person to person, but they don't have the time, and so you can really have much bigger effect by having 80% covered than by having 70% covered, and you don't get such a big difference by going from 0 to 10%. So the value of so it turns out that even though if you charge for BedNet, you get a bit of money, per case of malaria averted, what Pascaline's work shows is that actually it's cheaper to give them for free. And that's only true because people effectively use them. So it was pretty important work, I think. And one where going into it, I think she and anyone else was pretty open-minded about which way it could go. It was not at all obvious. And there are contexts where you could think that it's true for BedNets. It's been replicated many times in many contexts for many types of population. But it doesn't mean that it's not true for other things. So it doesn't rule out that inside in general. It's just not applicable in this case, which I think was an important piece of research, which is why I take the liberty of attributing it to its rightful author. With that, let me go to the subject of today's talk. This is related in a sense to BedNets because it's about it's a design of fight against poverty, but it's really talking about, I want to see, really it's a review of the work of many people, trying to look at what came to me as one of the big important transversal conclusions of the work that we did when we wrote the book Poor Economics with Abhijit Banerjee. What happened with Poor Economics was written by chapter, which is where we tend to think about issues in development. One chapter for education, one chapter for health, and one chapter for savings, and one chapter for credit. And it's a sensible way to go about writing such a book. But towards the end, we realized that there are insights that are actually transversal to all of this, in that they are pervasive to all of these issues, and they are relevant to all of these issues, and they apply to hope, and they apply to education, they apply to health, they apply to politics. And we briefly talked about them in the conclusion. What this is doing is taking one of these very important lessons, transversal lessons, and blowing it up in terms of importance, in terms of looking at what it is. One of these lessons, which we find throughout, is the importance of people's perspectives on life, and why people's perspective on life, and in particular their hope for the future, their aspiration, what they think they can achieve, has self-fulfilling impacts on what they do manage to achieve, and what this implies for how we should design programs for the poor. So let me start with one example. It's not meant to be dispositive in any way. It's more like just an illustration of the type of things that we might see. It's an example from a program called Ultra Poor Program. This program was originally designed by BRAC, an MFI in Bangladesh, competitor of Grameen, which was designed for the ultra poor, what they called the ultra poor, which were people who were too poor to actually borrow from microfinance. So people whom the microfinance officer didn't want to have anything to deal with, or people who didn't come forward. So usually like widows, women without an able-bodied husband, people who for some reason or another were not capable of were considered incapable of starting a viable enterprises. So BRAC was worried that they didn't have a way to get at these people, so they designed this program for them. It's not a microfinance program, it's a transfer. They didn't want to transfer cash, so what they did transfer is an asset. So a pair of cows, a few goats, a sewing machine, a stock to start a small trading business, you name it. People had a choice between a menu of these options. They also would get a stipend for a few weeks to help them, support them at the beginning of the work so that they weren't tempted to sell the asset immediately. And a lot of hand-holding. Weekly meetings with educational topics such as how to save, training on the use of the assets, mandatory deposits in savings accounts, etc. So it's really a bundle, and you can't really estimate each feature. But this bundle is being evaluated in lots of countries, including Bangladesh and including West Bengal, where I've been in charge of the evaluation along with Abhijit Banerjee and Raghav Chattopadhyay and Jeremy Shapiro, where we worked with Bandan, which is now India's largest MFI. At the time was one of the fastest growing, and since it's become the largest one. And the Bandan's program is very similar to this one, except it's with West Bengal. At the same time, it's been evaluated in at least 7 or 8 countries. And the results that I'm going to describe are being found pretty much in all of these countries. So it seems to be a robust result. And what we find for Bandhan is that there was a large increase in consumption of about 15%, not only while the program was on, so when people got the asset and were getting the stipend, but way beyond the end of the program. So 1 year after the program ended, and they had no stipend and no meetings and no nothing, their consumption was still 15% higher. Moreover, there was an increase in various sources of incomes of people. Not only cow rearing if they were getting a cow. So for example, even people who got a cow, so increase in their labor income from working and so increase from other type of business income. So people seem to have started doing many things, not only taking care of their cow. So this was we surveyed both at the end of the program, so 1 year after the asset transfer, and another year after. And another year after, people are still doing better, and if anything, the diversification results in terms of looking at all sorts of other sources of making money get strengthened over time. So when you calculate how much the increase in consumption, in particular because the increase of consumption doesn't show any sign of decay over time, it seems to be that the effect of the programs are larger than the value of what you gave. They are larger than putting this money in the bank and getting the permanent value of that asset. So how can this be? So it has to be that there was some unlocking of a poverty trap, that somehow the way the program, either the value of the money itself or the way the program was structured, produced more than the normal return of an asset. So there was something, it did something more, it has very steep return. So where do poverty trap come from? Poverty trap come from if there is over a range, a very steep relationship or a step between your income today and your income in the future. That means that if I can give you just a little more, if you're very, very poor, so you are on the wrong side of the poverty trap, the returns to your activities are not very high. So the returns are not very high, and there is a clear limit to what you can possibly do, and so you remain poor. But there could be over a range, a big step. And if you manage to go above this step, then if you manage to invest just to be above the threshold, then you become richer by one chunk. So over a range, poor people become poorer and poorer till that sort of stabilizes around some steady state. And above a threshold, you enter a zone where the income grows faster than that of richer people, which is a classical case of diminishing return, so that you have kind of a division of the population between very poor who stay poor and the less poor who converge to a better place. And that means that there are some investments you can do that will make people distinctly better off, more than 1 for 1. The classical example of that is a nutrition-based poverty trap, which is since we need at least, let's say, 1,200 calories to be able to be physically active, if the wages are so low that by working the whole day, you would only make 800 calories, then you're not able to work. So you will work very little and be very, very unproductive and stay very, very poor. If I give you a small bump, let's say because you have some land, you have some non-labor income, then you can use the money from that land to feed yourself. And even if the wage is very low, you can still earn that, put a whole, now that you've been fed because you got your 1,200 calories from your non-labor income, you can work, and in addition from the fact that you were richer to start with than someone who has no land, this is magnified by the working of the labor market, that you are able to put a full day of work, even when the wages are very low. So this is a classical example of the poverty trap. So the question that we asked ourselves is what could be the source of the poverty trap in the ultra-poor program. So the first natural explanation, given what I just said, is that it's nutrition-based. It's like these people were so poor that they didn't have enough to eat, and because they didn't have enough to eat, they couldn't work. Now we give them a cow, so at least the cow has some milk, or they could, even if they had sold the cow, that's some money that they could put aside, and that puts them that make them able to work now. So it's unlikely to be the explanation, because if it were the case, then what you would find is that now that people are richer because of the cow, they should increase their food consumption more than proportionally, because they are in the range where there are huge return to feeding yourself properly, because then you can do something else with all that gained productivity. You can start being active and work hard. So we should see, if it were the case, that almost all of the extra consumption that they have is in the form of food. In fact, we find a 15% increase in the consumption overall and 17% in food consumption. So very similar. It seems they increased food proportionally. So that's not very compatible with the nutrition-based poverty trap. Moreover, what we find is within the food expenditure, they have substituted towards higher price, not necessarily more nutritious calories. So they bought less of the whole grain and more meat, for example, which is very, very expensive per calorie. So they're probably happier as a result. So I'm not passing judgment on this, but it's if they were starving, they would have maximized the extra money they're getting in getting the cheapest calorie possible. So it suggests this is not really what was going on. Another possibility is credit constraints. That would be what economists would pretty much naturally think of. But the program was run by an MFI in a microfinance organization in the village where they work, precisely because they couldn't get these people to borrow. So it is not credit constraint in the usual sense of the term, that these people either have no collateral or they have no access to a provider, because there is a provider who is lending without collateral who is not able to lend them because they don't have a project. So it's not credit constraint in that sense. One possibility that occurred to us is that what has really changed is their mental health. And in fact, what we do see is we see no distinct improvement in their actual concrete physical health as measured by their ability to carry activity of daily livings and things like that. But what we do find is better self-reported health and fewer symptoms of depression, which we collect using a very typical scales, and fewer symptoms of stress. So people are basically much, much happier and feeling much calmer and doing much better. And one possibility is that this is the channel which made them able to accomplish more. That they were before stuck into a trap where they were thinking that they're useless and they cannot really do anything. And then someone came up and gave them an asset and gave them some, empowered them to use it, and they felt, oh, maybe I can do something with my life as well. And I don't have the proof that it's the case, so that's why it's just an example. But I think it's motivating in terms of thinking, well, do we have evidence accumulated throughout the literature that in fact you could have mental health or hope induced poverty traps, where the fact that you are poor make you hopeless, and the fact that you're hopeless make you poor, because that changes the way you behave. So that's kind of what I want to explore today. And in particular, I want to see whether hope functions as something like a capability in the Amartya Sen sense of the term, which means something which has intrinsic value. It's better to be hopeful than hopeless, but also allows people to realize your potential. So something akin to health or to education or to other form of human capital. Something which is valuable in itself and valuable instrumentally. So I'm going to proceed in 3 steps, look at that in 3 steps. First, from the point of view of taking the classical economic perspective of a rational decision maker, see why for a rational decision maker, dire perspective can easily be self-fulfilling. then look at the impact, forget the hypothesis of fully rational, fully informed decision maker for a moment, and look at two things. Look at whether hopelessness leads to a change in decision-making capability. So not only you have harder decisions to make, but you have less equipment to make them. You're less equipped to make them. And a third, somewhere in between a little bit, look at hope and decision in a world where people are thinking but not fully rational. So let's look at the rational expectation model first. So go back to the nutrition model idea and think of someone who is not very productive. So he's very poor. So someone we met, for example, that we describe in Poor Economics, he cannot get a construction job because he's too weak. So he's spending his time like next to a lake where he can sort of catch fish, but he doesn't know how to swim. So he can't swim in the lake, but on the bank of the lake, he catches fish. So he knows, he was talking to us, so he knew that he would never be able to have a really good nutritional status in the current situation. Because he was not strong enough to get the jobs where he would actually earn enough when he earned money. So he might well have decided that there was no point maximizing physical fitness, since he was not going to be able to cross that threshold very easily. So if he came across a little bit of money one day, more fish or something like that, he wouldn't actually make sure to make the most of it, because there was no point. He would do something else, like he would give it to, he had kids, and so he would try and get something for his kids, like little treat for his kids, who normally he couldn't do that. He wasn't really taking care of his kids much, so he would kind of do that, use the money for that, which is perfectly valuable, but ensure that he all stayed in that very, very unfit state. Now, if he had anticipated, instead of like temporary boons in something like an increase in wages, for example, or a permanent transfer, that would make sure that he would become productive enough to actually work, then it would be worthwhile continuing to invest more, and then maybe he would start to invest more in his own health. So the anticipation of future poverty exacerbates current poverty, because the anticipation of future poverty for someone who is on the wrong side of the poverty trap removes the incentive to be exactly at the best of what you could do, because the best of what you could do is just not good enough to be worth it. You might as well, it's very, very, the marginal return of little bit more fitness is just too small to be worth the sacrifice. So the same logic that applies to this case, where there is a key threshold between having enough calories to be fully functional and having just enough to survive, applies to any situation where an investment has a threshold before it becomes profitable. For example, the minimum scale for a business. When you look at businesses in developing countries, everything seems to suggest that there are steps in the production function of those businesses. So consider, for example, a tailor. There is a big difference between having 0 sewing machine and having 1 in terms of what you're able to achieve. And there is a big difference between 1 sewing machine and a mechanical machine. And there is a difference between a mechanical machine and a big workshop with bigger export grade machines. So each of these corresponds to an investment, because you cannot buy 1/10 of a machine. You have to buy the full machine. So that's require a discrete fixed investment that some people will feel that they'll never be able to do. So some people feel they'll never be able to buy 1 sewing machine. Some people feel they'll never be going to be able to switch to like the larger kind of machine. Some people feel they might never be able to switch to the export grade. And if you know that you'll never be able to cross that because no one's going to give you a loan, or no one gives you a loan big enough, then it's not particularly sensible to try to optimize every single little business decision, because you might do very, very well within your constraint. You might become a little bit richer, but there is an end to it, Because in the end, with just one sewing machine, there is only so many dresses that you can do in one day. So why work to be as productive as possible when the return to that are quite limited, especially if you are also the mother of 5 children and you have other issues to contemplate beside your business. Your limited attention might be better devoted to other aspects of your life than to maximize every single little decision in this case. Note that what is irrational here is not to not fully be invested in the business and maximize the productivity fully. What would be irrational would be to, in the context where it's very difficult to cross these steps, is to think that you're going to succeed. The irrational people are the entrepreneurs. Now, they are the ones who some of them will succeed, and a lot of them will fail. But on average, they are the ones who are making a mistake. So this is what Kahneman and Sharot call the optimism bias, which Silicon Valley is full of. So this idea that when there is these steps, and to the extent that there's some value in spending directing your attention to other things than your business, can explain what many puzzles that development economists, including myself, have stumbled on over the years, and which may in fact not be puzzles in the end. One is, for example, that small stores often run out of phone cards or of change. So this recharge, if you've been to developing countries, you get this prepaid and you can buy a recharge. The recharge don't take any space. So the shops should really always carry them, because if you come and you try to buy a recharge and you don't have and you don't have one, then you're going to tell your business elsewhere. And yet, Kramer and Robinson have shown that in a lot of cases, people stock out of phone cards, which seems to be like a way of mismanaging your stock. Even more striking, paper by John Robinson, Laurie Beeman, they run out of change. So they can't do a sale because they have run out of change. And calculating that, these are kind of every day you're losing some sales because you've run out of change. We've looked at that with John Robinson, again, Michael Kramer, and found farmers don't use fertilizer, even though the marginal return of using fertilizer are huge, of the order of 50%. So it seems like a spectacular investment. On the other hand, well, you need to think about it and go and pick it up, etc. And people have reasonably small fields. So even though the marginal return of using fertilizer are huge in our context in Kenya, it's possible that the extra money you would get by in fact thinking of using it, etc., is too small to be worth thinking about it, learning about it, doing it properly, going to the city, etc., as opposed to doing what you've always been doing, which doesn't require much thinking. Another fact that sort of goes along this line is when you ask small businesses, and now very popular programs are for small businesses is this kind of business training program, some business training program for small businesses. All the evaluations around suggest very limited or no effect of those programs, except one which compared two versions, the standard version and a version which focuses instead on rule of thumb. So the rule of thumb are very simple lessons such that pay yourself a salary every week, the rest is only for the business. This type of very, very simple things, forgetting about accounting. And what they found is much larger, this is Antoinette Shaw and Greg Fisher, they found much larger impact of the rule of thumb training than the very detailed training. Because the rule of thumb is like something that people can attend to. And I want to attend to, given that there is not really a point of mastering every single detail of a business that's always going to be quite mediocre anyway. Symmetrically, the fear of loss, which is some version of hopelessness, may lead to very conservative behavior. For example, Jonathan Murdoch, long time ago now in the early 90s, showed that people might not use the high-yielding varieties when they because even though the returns are large, the risk is also larger, and they don't want to find themselves in a situation where they've lost everything. So the fear that you might lose and you're already kind of at the brink keeps you from doing something that you know on average should work out quite well. Likewise, people do not migrate to the city, sometimes because they fear losing access to their social network, which would protect them in case of a shock. So again, here is the fear of something bad happening in the city and I've lost access to my network, which holds me back from going to the city where I could earn much more money. So, of course, all of this comes at a cost. There is a loss of income from being too conservative, but it's just, a bit of money from that. But there is something which is much more important than the loss of income, is the human loss that comes from, for lack of a better word, I would call the lack of self-discovery. If you don't throw yourself with complete self-dedication into a venture, it being your business or being something else, how would you know that you would have been good at it? It's like you won't know. And therefore, maybe some of these people who think that they can't really have a great business would have had a great business if they had tried, and if they had enough hope and enough security to take the jump. And I think that's something that we're discovering here. So a particularly sad example of this human cost is the case of education, where many parents seem to believe that the returns to education are first low and then very high, which is actually not true, which is when we estimate returns to education, it seems to be that it's more or less proportional. So every year brings you an extra 7%. But people seem to think that there is not much value in the first few years of education. In Morocco, where we asked the question, people think there is zero value of going to primary education, but there is very high return if you manage to get to secondary school. So the only value of primary education is that it's a lottery ticket for secondary school, which is itself a lottery ticket for a job in the public sector. That implies that investing in education is not particularly optimal. You should invest fully or not at all. That implies that if parents brand some of their children are stupid very early on, they're not going to invest in them. And those children will receive very little investment. And there is evidence actually from a graduate student, from someone who just graduated from Stanford Econ, who shows that not only that, but people have completely wrong views of the intelligence of their children. So they will also do that based on pretty bad evidence. But it's completely self-fulfilling because the parents don't invest in the child, the teachers don't invest in the child eventually persuade themselves that really they are not that, they must be stupid since everybody thinks they are stupid, and they don't invest in themselves, and finally they will never discover what this child was capable of. So the perspective become essential. So that means that hope works as a capability. We need hope to start getting going. So hope works as a sort of fuel. It makes us capable of achieving things. And it's also very important in giving us the impetus to invest in our businesses or in ourselves, and therefore in the creation of the capacity of other type of capability, such as education. And there's two examples of that are interesting, specifically on education, showing the role of aspirations and the role of the perspective on the decision to educate themselves. One is from research that I have done with Rohini Pandey and Laurie Beeman. What we look at is we look at an Indian policy which was which had reservation for women at the local level. What reservation means is that in some villages, only the woman can run to be the head of the village. And the way they do it in India to avoid political manipulation is every election, 1/3 of the village is randomly selected, and they can only elect a woman. So we can compare places which have had experience with a woman leader due to this policy, which are entirely comparable to other places which haven't had that experience. And what we find is that what we did, so we did a number of research projects with that, on that, but one of the projects we did is to look at the aspirations of girls and their parents, for girls and for boys. So we look at teenagers, we interview both the teenagers and their parents and ask, what do you want the girl to do? What do you want her career to be? How long you want them to study? And what we find is that in places where you have had women leader, the gap in aspirations for the girls and boys career narrows, and the gap in aspiration between how much education you want them to get also narrows. More importantly, the narrowing of this aspiration gap, it does go with a narrowing of the actual achievement in education, which is that you see in places where women have been the head of the policymaker, a complete catch-up of the girls with the boy in terms of dropout from secondary school. And what's striking, the reason why this is striking is that the policymakers at the local level have nothing to do with secondary school. So they have no direct role into this policy. It's only through this aspiration channel that the gap closes. Another example, which is more direct in a sense, is Rob Jensen ran this experiment where he sent recruiters for call centers, which are very popular in India. He sent recruiters for this call center in villages in and around Delhi, not in Delhi, in North India, not too far from Delhi, but far enough that these are places where they don't typically go. And he went to some randomly selected places and left some others as control group. And what he found is that in the places where he did send the recruiter, people have, girls are more likely to stay in school longer, they delayed marriage and they delayed fertility. That's because there was no direct effect for them. It's not necessarily the sisters of the girls who went to the BPO, but just seeing some girls going and the perspective that, oh, this is actually, there is a good perspective for my daughter, changed the investment. So the perspective rationally changed the type of investment you're making. Once these girls are educated, very few actually end up going to a BPO, but they all have a better life as a result of being educated and having their kids later. So this is kind of a first set of things, like staying with this complete classical way of thinking about the way people make decisions. You can see why your anticipation are often self-fulfilling in terms of what you actually achieve. But we can go one more step and ask something which is a bit more controversial perhaps among economists, and which is it the case that this lack of perspective or this hopelessness can change not only what they have to decide on, but change the resources that they have available to make those decisions. So there is a literature at the border between economics and psychology that explores just that. So the first thing to observe is that there is a very strong correlation between depression, which are measured with the same battery of survey questions worldwide, and poverty, both if you compare across countries. So people who live in poorer countries are more likely to be depressed compared to people who live in richer countries, and within countries. So within a country, it's very correlated with wealth as well. So of course, it could just be a correlation, and it could have nothing to do with causation. Assuming that it's to some extent causal, there are various mechanisms for that. One is that the poor people tend to live in very stressful environments. So in the moving to opportunity experiment in the US, what you did is you took very poor people and you moved them from very poor neighborhood to slightly richer neighborhood. That didn't affect anything to their own life. They didn't get richer as a result, which was the disappointment of that program. But what did happen is that they became much, much happier, much less stressed out. So in terms of mental health intervention, the author calculated that it's just as cost effective as giving Prozac to these people. And that's because they weren't stressed out by crime around them and noise and violence and all that. So that's one thing. Another set of things that go with being poor is to have all sorts of stuff to worry about in your common life. So you have for example, you have no clean water. So you are just, you need to keep remembering to go pick up the water, boil the water, etc. So there is a number of distractions that keeps, popping up, and that's stressful. Many things that you need to think about. So we have a paper, for example, in Morocco where we partner with a company that gave people credit to have access to drinking water. And even though they had to pay for the credit and it was pretty expensive, they were much, 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 much happier as a result of having gotten the connection to get drinking water in their home. This is work with Pascaline Dupas as well. But the third explanation, which is the one I want to insist on now, is this worry about the future. So there is a very interesting paper by Johannes Haushofer and Mathieu Chemin and Jostelad, which shows that, which compares people in Kenya, farmers in Kenya, before they harvest, depending on whether the rain was good or bad. So the harvest is not realized yet, but they can already see, the writings on the wall in terms of what it's going to be. And what they found is the people who experience the bad shock exhibit much more symptoms of depression than the people who have who have been subject to a good shock. Even though the income realization they have not observed yet, but they know what's coming. Keep that example in mind because we're going to come back to that. I want to focus now in the rest of today about this worry about the future, which is our idea of hopelessness and lack of perspective. And what does that do to us to be very worried about the future? So, there's a recent book by Sandil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, which you may have seen, it's called Scarcity, which is precisely about that. It's a whole book about this very question. And they introduced a very useful concept of boundaries. So what they show is that worrying in one domain, for example, worrying about the future, financial worries, either real worries, such as your harvest, for example, being poor or not, or artificially produced in the lab just by asking people to think about financial problems, reduce your bandwidth. So reduce you become absorbed by these worries about the future. You wonder, how am I going to be able to deal with it? And therefore, you can't focus on something else. And that affects the two things that we need to function and decide effectively. One is your fluid intelligence, so really your cognitive capacity. And the other is your self-control, your executive functions. So they give a number of examples in the book. There are two examples that are particularly telling, which are reported in the same paper. In one, they did the experiment in the US. They asked people at the mall to think about having to repair their car. And in one case, they have to spend $300. The insurance will pay half of it, so $150 off pocket. In the other case, they have to spend $1,500. And they have richer people and poorer people in this mall. They ask people's income. And then after thinking about this problem and writing down what they would do for fixing their car problem, they take an IQ test, standard Raven matrix type of test. What they find is for the rich people, there is no difference in the performance on the Ravens test between people who got the $150 problem and the $1,500 problem. But for the poor people, the performance on the IQ test was reduced a lot for people who had to think about the hard problem. As much as the size of the effect is as big as going sleepless for a night. So it's really a huge impact, and it's not even a real problem. They just have to figure out hypothetically what they would do. So that's the IQ part. And then they do, then there are similar experiments showing that then if you then ask them to choose between an apple and a piece of cake, people are more likely to choose the piece of cake, so less likely to experience self-control, again, if they are poor and exposed to one of these large problems. Or in the case they don't do the piece of cake experiment, in their case what they do is that they ask people to to do a test where you, if there is a red dot, if there is a dot on the left, you have to press left. But if there is a diamond on the right, you also have to press left. So the dot is, you have to press it on the right side, but when the diamond comes, it has to be reversed. So this is something which is not hard, but you have to overcome your basic instinct, which is to go where the symbol is. So this is a sign of self-control, being able to resist that. And I find again that the poor people being given the hard problem do much worse on the self-control problem. So it was stress induced in the lab. Then they have similar results by looking at real stress induced with sugarcane harvests. People just before the harvest, when they haven't any money yet, so they are it's the hungry season, they are very concerned about the next day, and people just after the harvest, when they are, much more peaceful. So in this case, the poor and the rich, the IQ of the poor and the IQ of the rich is similar, but it's when they are subject to this kind of either real or imaginary worries, less of it is available. Less of their cognitive capacity is available to them for use in making decisions. Less of their self-control is available to them in making the right decisions. So that creates poverty traps as well. And the dire perspective changes from the process, not only that you would be making different decisions, but because you're not even fully equipped to make the right decision now. So you're much more likely to make mistakes. In addition to this scarcity idea, there is a possible link to stress. Stress, depression, pessimism, the worry about the future goes hand in hand with stress. When you're stressed out or when you're depressed, you produce, you have higher elevated level of cortisol and other index. And what several laboratory studies have shown is that, number one, when you are exposed to stress, you have more cortisol. Number two, if I inject you with cortisol, you will make more impatient decisions. So cortisol itself, in addition from the mechanisms that Mullenweg and Shafir talk about, cortisol itself actually reduces the cortisol itself, which is produced by stress, which is produced by lack of perspective, reduces your ability to function effectively. There is limited evidence from the field that poverty and shocks, bad shocks, increase the level of cortisol. There's 4 interesting studies. One from blue-collar workers in Sweden, which shows that cortisol levels increase when they lost their job. One looking at the children of Progressa beneficiaries. Progressa is a big social transfer program in Mexico, showing that the children of the Mexico beneficiaries have less cortisol than children of non-beneficiaries, which is linked to the depression in their mothers. Then, if you remember that study from Kenya, which showed that the farmers who expect a bad harvest because of bad rainfall shocks are more likely to be stressed and depressed. They also have higher elevated level of cortisols. And finally, on the other sense, a very recent study by Johannes Haushofer and Jeremy Shapiro looks at just giving people money, either in the form of, with no strings attached, either in the form of regular monthly transfer or in the form of a lump sum. And what they find is that if you give people transfers that are large enough, their cortisol level significantly declines. It doesn't hold true with smaller transfer though. So I'm not saying you should come away with this saying, oh, this is all clear. Poor people are stressed out people have elevated level of cortisol, and therefore they make very poor decisions. We should start deciding for them. because this is a very recent, very nascent field, and the evidence from the biological mechanism is very limited. In particular, the link between stress-induced chemical and economic decision-making is tenuous. And some people even argue that being stressed out actually makes you laser sharp and focused, and you're going to make better decisions when you're stressed out. So there is more work to be done there. It's also unclear whether there is habituation to poverty, whether you would get used to the situation rather than, it's not like a shock all the time. And finally, it's unclear what it means for policy. Does it mean like with the MTO conclusion is very clearly that, you have to improve the economic situation of people and they'll have better mental health. Conversely, mental health people are arguing that we should give mental health intervention to people and they'll become richer. And right now there is little work that allows us to compare these two approaches and see whether there could be a combination. But I think it's useful. I want to bring it up because it's a very rich field and just emerging where there is potentially a lot more to do. The third type of topic that I want to address is this situation where the poor and the rich, let's go back to a world where they have the same capacity to make decisions, but where neither of us, neither the poor nor the rich, might make the best decision at every point. And here, in this case, I want to look at the possibility that if you're hopeless, you might decide, not be compelled, like in the case I just looked at, but decide to not look at the future, because there is really no fun in looking at the future that looks horrible. But by deciding not to look at the future, you also prevent yourself from making the decision that you should be making to avoid the worst part of that future. So that's the third of the in-between issue. So it might be necessary to protect your sanity. There is a lot of things that we are constantly shutting off in order to be able to function. When you walk down the streets, you're not thinking of the number of bicycles on Stanford campus that could kill you. All of the, what's going to happen if the situation in Syria explodes, and otherwise you couldn't really do anything. There are too many things to contemplate. However, in some cases, this decision to hold back thinking about the future, although we need it, we might even need it even more when we're poor, because there are more bad things that are coming in the future. But that might prevent you to take some decisions that you should make. So for example, if you pay attention to the bicycle on the campus, you might avoid being run over by them. And if you pay attention to the fact that you might become sick, then you might be more likely to buy health insurance. And in fact, one huge puzzle in developing countries is people, despite when health insurance is offered to them, maybe the same puzzle here, we'll see, but when health insurance is offered to them, tend to not buy it, even when it's at fairly straightforward, catastrophic health insurance product, which are not very expensive and seem to be quite simple to explain. Moreover, we have a paper with 1 million authors looking at various contexts. And in each of these contexts, there was a baseline survey that was done on a random set of people. And then the entire population, some of which were surveyed and some of which were not surveyed, got an option to get health insurance. And people were more likely to buy health insurance if they had participated to the baseline survey. And the reason for that, presumably, is because the baseline survey forced them to consider, it was full of questions about health, because it was a baseline survey about health insurance. So it forced them to consider the possibility that they might be sick, and therefore increase the salience of the health compared to what they would normally do, and therefore increase the chance that they would sign up for health insurance. Another puzzle is people are not buying burial insurance, even though, it's in a paper from South Africa, even though funerals are extremely expensive, and therefore your family members bear a huge cost after you're dead. And that's presumably because they don't particularly like the fact that they are going to die, and they don't like to think about it. Another example is public health messaging. So there is a big literature in social psychology on which type of messages are more effective in convincing people to take actions. And what this literature has tended to find is that loss frame messages, which is if you don't get tested for breast cancer, you might get breast cancer and you might die, are more effective than positive frame message, which are if you do get tested for breast cancer, you're going to detect it early and therefore you'll survive. And the possibility is that these negative messages force you to contemplate the risk that we would normally avoid contemplating. We are thinking normally we think of ourselves as healthy people, so the fact that I'm telling you that if you take your breast exam, you'll continue to stay healthy is no big news. The big news is the opposite, which is the possibility of your mortality that is being put in front of you. So the issue here is that those who risk suffering the most negative shocks in the future know that it's the case, say because they are very, the weather affects them, etc., may spend the least time thinking about the future and hence may be least likely to be protected from it. I'm conscious of time, so I'll give you a last example and then wrap up. Which is the tricky part is when the hopelessness becomes hopelessness about yourself, which is not only the external performance, but say we are very aware about our own failings. And so we know we are not perfect people. In particular, we tend to make plans and not follow through. We plan to go to the gym, and then we don't go to the gym, etc. But we also know it. We're not fooled. So there is some hopelessness about what you will be able to do in the future and whether you will be able to stick to your plans. And that hopelessness may be reasonable because it is the fact that we often make plans and not follow through. But that very self-awareness may in turn prevent us to make such plans and therefore end up costing us even more. There's a very interesting example of how it can cause a poverty trap in work by Banerjee and Mullainathan about temptation goods. So what they look at is temptation goods are goods that we enjoy in the moment, but we don't look forward to. So for people who like economic jargon, the discount rate is 0. So you like them today, but you really have when you think about it, eating them tomorrow you have no such enjoyment. So what I give to my students the example of Skittles. I kind of like Skittles, but I never really look forward to a bag of Skittles. It's not something that gives me no joy to think of eating a bag of Skittles. So that's a temptation good for me. If it's in front of me, I'll be happy to eat it. And then there are the regular goods, the one for which there is a normal discounting process. For example, reading a book I like to read today, and I like to think about myself reading a book in the future or watching television or something like that. So suppose that we are aware of that. I think if you introspect, you realize that A, there are temptation goods for you, and B, you're aware that there are temptation goods. We are not naive about it. So you know that temptation goods loom large. So suppose that you're a very poor person who is subject to some temptation, let's say hot tea, like sugary tea or Skittles, but on the other hand, you would like to have a television. You really look forward to having it, but you need to save towards it because it's expensive. So you are in front of a bag of Skittles or a cup of tea. You consider whether you should save and not eat it in order to progressively accumulate towards your television. Well, the problem is if you do that, if you manage to really overcome your attraction for the Skittles today, tomorrow you have no guarantee that your future self of tomorrow is not going to give in to the temptation. And viewed from today, you couldn't care less about the bag of Skittles tomorrow. So if you know that you're going to eat it anyway, then you might as well eat it today when you actually want it. So you're not very happy because you would prefer to have the television viewed from today's perspective. But since you know it's not going to happen, then you might as well just eat the Skittles and forget about the television. So the fact that you know that you won't be able to carry through, that your future self is likely to expropriate you, exacerbates the temptation, the strength of the temptation, compared to a situation where we would be blissfully unaware, where sometimes we would just, feel good and not do something, and maybe progressively accumulate towards the television. And if temptation good at things that are quickly satiated, like tea or Skittles, so that there is only so many Skittles you're going to eat, while the good that we look forward to are more expensive, then this can be the source of a poverty trap. Because a rich person can both afford, as many Skittles they're going to eat, and have a little bit of money left over. And in addition, they know that it's again true tomorrow. So it's worth saving some today, because tomorrow they know that something is going to be left, both for the Skittle and for saving towards the television. So you could create a poverty trap that way. The mechanism, the underlying preferences are exactly the same, the psychology is the same, the decision is the same, but it's just the marginal utility today and tomorrow of the Skittle versus the television is different when you're rich and when you're poor. And that means that the poor may end up save less than the rich, even though, people say, well, of course the poor will save less, they have less money. But I like to repeat that they'll have less money today and tomorrow, so they should be saving. But if savings is linked to this hope that you're going to be able to do something good with the saving, then you might have this mechanism. So let me just conclude that I hope that I convinced that hope can operate as a capability, something which is valuable in itself, as well as something we need to realize your potential. That has policy implication. I want to insist on 3. One is there is a value in policies that remove the worst branch of the tree, because these are things that discourage people from doing things. Minimum income, like threshold income, that everybody would be entitled to, that the rich wouldn't need to get because it's too little, but that they would be in principle entitled to, that would serve as a floor. Protection against health catastrophes, either through hospital or insurance, etc. The second thing is that it's important to make people aware of opportunities and possibilities in order to affect their aspiration. So that's the example of the BPO, the back office processing operation in India, or the woman leader. The third one is that the goalposts should be closer so that people can see themselves achieving them. A very far goalpost, like finishing secondary school, it might be too far to even start on the race. If people don't know that they can make the first goalpost, then there is no point. And that, I think, is important because I think in a lot of countries, things tend to be the opposite. You tend to, for example, in India now, they've removed all the intermediate exams to only leave the secondary school exams. So then there is nothing intermediate. So people don't have a sense of progress towards something. So I'm going to stop here and thank you very much.
So there's an underlying assumption in what you've presented that the aspiration or hope and the fact that the poor cannot have what the rich have or the non-poors is that they're both aspiring to have the same things. And I think in a society where everyone wants the same thing, but they have different capacities, the poor end up being hopeless. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that assumption. Because societies that are poor can also be very hopeful and happy if they're not aspiring to have what the rich have.
So I don't think, for example, in this model, the poor and the rich don't want the same thing. The rich wants yacht and the poor wants television. So you want different things. And still the mechanism goes through. So it's not that you have to say, well, my life is not worth living unless I have the $5 million mansion. but it is true that it's moving towards more. It is an empirical fact, which is worth, given that you talked about being content. It is an empirical fact, it turns out, that the poor are significantly more depressed, stressed out, worried than the rich, both across the world and within. So that's just that, it's true you're asking people the same question, but it's not about what do you want? It's about, do you have trouble sleeping at night? Do you have?
But isn't that really a byproduct of the fact that the poor know and are living right next to the rich, and they see what the rich have?
It could be, yeah, it could be.
These really actually are exposed to common things which we all want, and that creates the depression in people who cannot have them.
It could be, although in very isolated village, there is a paper from Nepal, from Marcel Favchen, looking at very isolated village, where people are not really exposed to anything, where they get very depressive. They're the poorest person in the village. So you get those rank of relative poverty conditional on their own. So I think those invidious comparisons, they are not only with the rich and what would be possible, but they're also across people. And also it cuts both ways, because the access to seeing what the rest of the world does also creates opportunities. So because there's some work, for example, on cable television coming to Indian villages, which have tend to come to with empowerment, a sense of empowerment, particular women empowerment. So it could cut, I take the point that it could cut both ways in principle, but seem to have gone in the opposite direction.
I wanted to question the extent to which we could consider hope as a capability. I don't think anything that you've said has sort of supported the idea that it would be intrinsically valuable, though it certainly seems instrumentally valuable in some cases. But it looks like hope is valuable in cases where we're going to achieve the thing that we hope will happen. But it looks like it might be disvaluable in many cases where that hope is false. And it seems that the thing that really comes out of your presentation is that it's important that we provide things that would be sort of the appropriate object of hope. So it's important that we provide circumstances in which people have reason to hope or reason to be hopeful. Obviously, false hope is kind of disvaluable. So I wondered what you had to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's I was talking to someone who was inspired by this type of research and decided that they would try a program where they would give people inspirational video about role models, and they wanted to pick very kind of unusual people from the community, from people who have succeeded beyond expectations. And I thought this could be a bit counterproductive, both because of what you're saying, which is if people are convinced, then they could be very disappointed, and then you're really misleading them. Or because if people are not fooled, then they might think that it doesn't at all apply to them. There was an interesting study which tried to bring role models into schools. So what they did is both they showed average statistics on the benefits of education. So people with so much years of education have so much more money. And this had big impact on people's perception and on enrollment and on performance on test scores. So the very raw fact. Then there was another treatment which was that combined with sending to the school a role model, so someone who had really succeeded. And the idea was that it would increase the effect of the statistics. And what they found is that reduced the effect of the statistics, that people stopped paying attention and didn't believe what was given to them in the statistics when they saw the role model. And the interpretation they give is that then people realize that the statistics are an average, well, if there are some people who do very well, there must be somebody on the other end of that who's doing very badly, and that's probably me. So it increased the variance of the statistic that was given. So it's actually counterproductive.
Today's Wall Street Journal carries an article about the growth of the great American underclass that is being developed. Has your research gotten to the point where you think you maybe provide some insights for solving this huge problem which seems to be coming down the road?
No, because I don't at all work in the US, and I think it's actually think it's on the basis of nothing, on the basis of no knowledge. I actually do think that it's a huge issue that a huge part of the poverty problem in the US is this problem of hopelessness and despondency that goes with it. That come from when you read the book A Random Family about a set of characters in New York. You realize how this complete lack of perspective lead them to do all sorts of take all sorts of action that would seem really crazy from the outside. But I'm really not at all an expert, but there are many people who are, so hopefully they will make progress on that.
You spoke about hope and hopelessness are not 0 and 1. There's a continuum between hope and hopelessness. Have you studied the area inflection point? And something analogous to what you've done with poverty trap, there's an inflection point. Is there a point where one enters the area from being less hopeful to more hopeful?
No, that's a great question, but not yet. I'm not at that level of quantification. I don't think people are, but I think that's a great area to look at. Well, I want to say one thing about the intrinsic value behind the instrumental value. It goes with depression and being in all of the surveys, like your perspective for your sense of people's sense of hope is very correlated with their answer on worries and depression. And I think it's it makes people extremely unhappy, which is probably I would say is intrinsically better to be happy than unhappy. But maybe that's an economist who think that it's.
Hi, I'm curious to know how readily this kind of research that you've talked about is integrated into policymaking.
Here and there, I mean, some bits of it. For example, the research on returns to education, on showing people what is the value of education, which is it's reasonably easy to do. So it's been taken up, like where, in particular in Latin America, there are a lot of effort to try and convey the information to parents and to children about the incremental value of each year of education, what they gain by staying in school and all that. So you have pieces. Some part of it is a little less clear. For example, the example that I just gave about removing all of the exams in India. I think it was trying to solve one problem while not paying attention to this one, because it was lacking that frame of mind. There is much more attention than there used to be, I think, on the issue of mental health more generally. The number of psychotherapists or psychiatrists per population in poor countries is like really, really, really amazingly low when you compare it to even other kind of doctors or other kind of. So it's not something that was considered to be particularly a priority. Maybe even shouldn't be a priority, but this type of thinking would think that at least some direct attention to mental health issues might feed back into poverty problems and vice versa. And I think there is much more recognition of that now, not at all thanks to me, who is kind of a latecomer to the party, but thanks to psychiatrists and psychologists who have drawn attention to the problem.
So I think with that, please join me in thanking Esther Duflo. Thank you very much.